Okay, so shall we start? 6 o'clock now. Okay.
Maybe just give a minute, I think, because people might just start logging in at 6. Just 1 minute.
Okay.
Yeah, we can start in a minute. Yeah.
I think we should start now, session.
Yeah,
we have this. Okay. So very good evening from New Delhi. I'm Chandabhushan, and I will be moderating today's COP26 dialogues on just transition. I work at iForest, and this COP26 dialogues on just transition is being organized by India Just Transition Center, which is a part of International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, in short, iForest. Now, today's dialogue is on defining just transition for India, imperatives for policy and planning. We have another dialogue coming up on 9th, which is going to discuss a global collaborative framework on just transition. And so please do join us also on 9th. It is an extremely exciting concept that my colleagues are putting forth, and in terms of how the world can come together on just transition. Now, before that, today's meeting is actually taking place when yesterday two very interesting things happened from India's perspective. The first was that India announced its new targets for 2030 as well as a net zero target for 2070. And the announcements are quite interesting from the perspective of coal, especially. India has pledged to install 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. It is going to improve emission intensity of its economy to close to 50%, reduce greenhouse gas emission by 1 billion ton by 2030, and then have a net zero target by 2070. Now, if you put all of them together, the first thing that comes out is that coal power is going to peak before 2030 in India. And as you know, coal power is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emission. About 50% of India's greenhouse gas emissions comes from coal power. And we consume a largest amount of coal in generating electricity. So this is a big news. It is also a big news from just transition perspective, because we will have to start planning for transition now if we are thinking of peaking our coal power in next 8 years, and then starting the reduction in coal consumption after that. The second important thing that happened yesterday was that there was a first parliamentary hearing on just transition that happened yesterday. We are really excited to inform you this, because it is important that parliamentarians understand this issue. They are engaged with this issue and are planning for it. And we were asked to make a presentation on just transition to Parliamentary Standing Committee. It was a proper court-like deposition with question and answer, and I'm really excited simply because I think our parliamentarians are quite aware and seized with this matter. The kind of questions they were asking yesterday, informed us that they are quite aware of what is happening on the ground. They are understanding the challenges of coal transition. So in this context, where India has announced an ambitious 2030 and a net zero target, and Indian Parliament has started discussing just transition, today's session is equally important simply because states or a program that is being implemented in Germany? Do we develop our own definition, processes, and programs? That's what the discussion is today. I'm excited that my colleague Shrestha is going to present to you our working paper on how just transition should be defined for India. We are not taking the responsibility of defining it for other countries simply because we are now convinced that just transition is very, very context specific and place specific. And countries and regions will have to define just transition to suit their purpose. So we are going to discuss what just transition means for India today. But we want to take feedback from other parts of the world. We have an extremely knowledgeable and eminent panel today to tell us what they think is happening in their part of the world, how they are defining just transition, and plus recommend to us based on what our working paper is on how India, considering Indian condition, should be defining just transition. So let me introduce you our panel today. We have Nikos. Nikos is the chair for energy and geopolitics at Center for Strategic and International Studies in the US, a very, very reputed global think tank. And Nikos works on a wide array of issues which relates to geopolitics of energy and climate change. He has worked on industrial policy for clean energy and just transition. He has been engaging with US foreign policy on these issues. So he has more than a decade of experience in these areas. And we are really excited because this Biden administration is talking big on just transition. And we are hopeful that Nikos will inform us what is happening in the US, as well as the potential of learning from US and other parts of the world. We have Shailendra Rajkumar from South Africa. Very excited to have him because he is right in the center of just transition debate in South Africa. Shailendra is working at the Secretariat of South African Presidential Climate Commission. And as a member of the commission, he's engaging with integrating key stakeholder and social partners across the economy in just transition discussion. So this commission is discussing just transition with various stakeholders, and Shailendra is part of those discussions. He has also served as chair of South Africa's industry task team on climate change. So he's also aware about industrial transition and the kind of issues that are going to impact industry in energy transition, and especially coal transition, because South Africa is heavily dependent on coal. So we will learn from Shailendra how South Africa is planning for just transition. And lastly, but not the least, we have Lucas. And Lucas is a senior researcher at Energy, Transport, and Climate Policy at Wuppertal Institute. A very, very reputed, and I have a lot of old friends in Wuppertal, known them for close to 2 decades, an excellent organization and a think tank. Glad to have you, Lucas. And Lucas will talk about what Germany is doing on just transition. And the German coal transition plan, the coal cap and coal phase out, we hope to learn from Lucas how much it is going to cost, how Germany is planning to do it. And then he will also provide his inputs on what he thinks. All three panelists will provide inputs on what they think about defining just transition for India. Extremely exciting program, not theoretical, very practical, very issue that is at the heart of implementation of just transition in India and across the world. So let me welcome all three panelists. We are really excited to have you here. And then let me introduce to you the researcher who has worked on doing this working paper on defining just transition for India, Shrestha, my colleague. Shrestha has been working on just transition since the inception of iForest. We started 2 years back, and she is now the director of India Just Transition Center. So let me start this program by requesting Shrestha to give her presentation. And then after that, we will have panel discussion and question and answer session. So thank you again. And Shrestha, to you now, please give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, CB. More popularly, everyone is saying Chandrabhushan, but I'm more comfortable calling you CB. So thank you very much for welcoming me and welcoming all of us. And I could not believe that we arranged this event today. As CB said, so many developments just happened within 24 hours. So we are very, very excited, and I'll just start. So basically, the reason we did this exercise was that for the past 2 years, 1.5, 2 years, we have been working on this issue. And a question that has been constantly coming to all of us, that how do you define it? How do you go to a policymaker and talk about it? How do you go to a local level person and talk about it? So this fundamental question became very important, and we thought we would address it through some research and our experiences. The way this working paper will put it up shortly after this event today, it covers 3 primary things. First, we have looked into the definitions and conceptual framings of just transition by various stakeholder groups. We have looked into the policy framings of it by various governments. The paper highlights 5 countries, but the research has looked into much more beyond that. And then finally, we have looked into the context of just transition in India and tried to come up with our definition. Of course, we had held brainstorming sessions around it and provide a contour of its framing. So when we come to definitions and conceptual framings, we have looked into 4 broad stakeholder groups, and there are many organizations we have looked into. The one is the labor unions. We have looked into environmental and climate justice groups, multilateral institutions like the World Bank, and finally UNFCCC. If I interpret all of this, there are some fundamental key points that are coming up through these framings. The labor unions, to begin with, are hugely emphasizing on the role of them, but also what's interestingly they're talking about is the formalization of the entire workforce in the new decarbonized economy. They are identifying the role of both governments as well as industries in the process. And finally, speaking of reskilling across the supply chain, not just coal or coal-based power. Environmental and climate justice groups are more asking for transformative changes in the extractive economy to a more regenerative one. A big focus is on building diverse coalition and working through a mechanism of democratic governance. Multilateral institutions like the World Bank are also hugely picking up on mechanisms of coordinated governance and long-term engagement processes, because it's not going to be something very short-term or few years. Of course, the focus is definitely on financing, not just for workers' transition, but also for mine closure and redevelopment of these areas. And finally, the UNFCCC, there will be more developments as the COP is going on. But there is the clear focus on job creation, transitioning of the fossil fuel sector and downstream industries. And right now, the major discussion is about supporting developing countries. The next question, we looked into the policy framing by governments, because India is yet to come up with any policy. But what can we learn, and particularly how it has been navigated in the policy space? Because a just transition is heavily influenced by the political as well as the economic climate of many of these countries. In Germany, particularly, so we have looked at the major laws, but of course, we have looked into many other things alongside. If we look at the coal phase out and the structural development acts together that has come up in Germany in the last year, it is highly focused around coal. And we have looked into, we have analyzed certain key parameters, same set of parameters for each of these countries. It is not so much looking into other downstream industries, and Lucas can elaborate on that further. The workforce focus is largely formal because of the workforce structure of the country around these fossil fuel sectors. It is focused on the coal regions very much, talks about social protection and social infrastructure that must be ensured, compensation packages that must be provided, and financial and structural supports. And finally, it is very much aware of the environmental pollution, land redevelopment, repurposing issues that JT must take into account. Coming to the US, it is the presidential executive order that the Biden administration has put forth in January this year. While this is not a law, but we looked into this because it gives a signal of a country's intention of what can happen. So basically, the US executive order as it stands is very comprehensive. It is not just looking into coal, it is looking into coal, oil, as well as gas. It is also talking of downstream sectors, such as like the steel and the cement. It is looking into formal as well as other informal workers, particularly the indirect employment. Spatial consideration is very much clear. And most importantly, it is talking of the communities of color because it is faced as EJ consideration, environmental justice. It has specified a compensation package. I know this is highly debated and Nikos can talk about it more. There are financial and structural support that will be provided to these regions. And finally, environmental pollution, land redevelopment becomes a key focus of it because the entire executive order is around environmental justice. Then there's the question of Canada, which has in 2020 November put a Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. It is still yet to be passed. The deliberations are ongoing, but the act is largely focused on coal. It is not explicitly mentioning any other sectors, but what can be inferred from the observation is because it is aligned to net zero, maybe going forward, it will be framed differently. The workforce largely is formal sector. The focus is also region-wide. And there is not so much explicit mention of financial support yet, and also the focus on environmental pollution, land redevelopment is not very clear as yet from the law. Then we have South Africa, which is we really looked very much into it because it is one of the leaders from the global South, which has taken forward issue of just transition since 2011, in fact. 2012, actually, South Africa included just transition in the National Development Plan. It went as an entire chapter. And then it came twice into the NDCs. Now, fossil fuel is a key thing and it is particularly in one province, Mpumalanga. So the focus is heavily on coal mining and coal-based power. It's not very clear to us as of yet what is the focus on the other downstream industries and the mechanism of addressing it. The workforce is both formal and informal. The focus is very much, of course, on the coal region. There are discussions a lot on social protection, social infrastructure. Informal workforce remains a key focus of this entire restructuring mechanism. Financial and structural support, yes, being discussed and negotiated. And finally, environmental pollution, land repurposing, and redevelopment measures are not very explicit, but I know there are discussions around it. But as of now, it is not very clear in papers. Finally, we have looked into Indonesia, and I'll be very short on this because Indonesia was a signatory of the Silesia Declaration in 2018, but not much has happened recently in the NDCs that the country has put forth, just transition has been mentioned. It is largely focusing on coal. It is focusing on some other downstream industries, but it remains to be seen how it will be fleshed out in the coming years. But the focus is definitely on informal sector, because Indonesia also has a huge, huge problem of informal economy. The biggest thing that the Global South is also asking, unlike the Global North, is support on financing from the international community. And it is very, very explicit in the framings of this JD. Overall, if we look into the policy framings of the countries we have analyzed and some others that the research looks into, one of the biggest focus is on coal and coal-based power. It is for the very it is for the clear reason that it is one of the biggest emission sources. But there is a little, much less focus on the oil and gas industry as of now. It is hugely influenced by the political mood and social acceptability of the issues. For example, Germany seems to be very explicit on coal and bold about it because it has a very positive experience of the past 50 years of transitioning the rural region. US has used the argument of environmental justice because it is a much more acceptable concept in the country since the time of the Clinton administration in 1994. It is a more easily, so they have been able to discuss it under environmental justice. Overall environmental protection, land redevelopment issues are much lesser in all of the framings. It is more of a workers' issues currently, less of an environmental issue. The worker focus, particularly in the Global North, is formal. Of course, the Global South countries are all speaking of informal workforce. But the mechanisms how to integrate the informal workforce, how to address their transition challenges are not very clear. And our only clear framing and discussion we have most elaborate is South Africa, but they are also struggling with the mechanism. And finally, the biggest challenge of the Global South remains financing, which has clearly come out in all the deliberations. So taking all of these, given the political context of it, what is easy to say, what is not easy to say, so how does India navigate this space? As we said, that it is a very context-specific issue. So to begin with, what we need to understand, what is the context of just transition in India? The first question is justice. There are actually four key issues of justice that just transition in India must address. Number one issue is poverty and deprivation. There is a huge poverty in many of the fossil fuel districts, particularly coal, where below poverty line population is 40% or sometimes more. There is a huge sense of deprivation due to poor access to healthcare, education, and many of the basic amenities such as clean drinking water even. And about, on an average, 50% of the population in these districts are therefore identified as multidimensionally poor by the union. The pollution burden and environmental justice issues in these regions are huge. All the coal and coal power districts are largely critically polluted, and the poor bear the health burden of it. So we have a clear issue of environmental justice in these regions. There is a historical injustice of displacement and poor rehabilitation because of land acquisition, forest land diversion, and so on in these regions. And finally, that leads to the question of social exclusion, where development has happened, but people have not been part of the process, or their rights have not been settled the way as it was required. Finally, then there is a question of the workforce nature, which is unique to India and also somewhat unique to the Global South. The fundamental difference is that we have a huge burden of informal, low income and unorganized workforce. It is 2.5 times in coal, the informal sector versus the formal sector. But if we look into all the fossil fuel and fossil fuel dependent sector, and IFORS did an analysis in June this year, the informal workforce together combined is nearly 3.5 to 4 times the formal workforce. So if we are thinking of a transition in the next 30 to 40 years, we really need to be conscious about this. These people are poorly skilled, they have poor education level, and therefore they have low mobility. So those things have to be addressed as well. The third issue in India is the economic dependence of this region on fossil fuel. Now, just talking about coal, because it is one of the fulcrum of our discussions most of the times, most of the coal districts are mono industry. So the entire economy in this region has grown around coal. Even a small business has come up because there is mining, or there is a power, and people will purchase something from them. For example, we are currently working in a district, Korba, which is India's top coal producer, where 50% of the district GDP is almost reliant on coal. Last year, we worked in Jharkhand, where the district we worked on has a GDP reliance of more than 21% on coal mining. The states are also largely dependent, and if we just looked at the direct tax revenues, 5 to 6% comes from coal mining itself. But what is very interesting is also they're hugely reliant on oil revenue, such as from petrol and diesel taxes, and which is in fact double of the coal dependence in most cases. And finally, India's context is about also the fossil fuel transition outlook, which defines our political economy of this issue. India now has pledged a 27 net zero target, but that needs to encompass all fossil fuel and not just coal. We have now 40 to 50-year time on this. We need a system-wide outlook that is necessary, because we did an assessment this year where there are 120 districts at least in this country which is going to be affected in the next 30 to 40 years. And even if we just look at the next 10 years, there are 60 districts, and these are not just coal or thermal power districts. Automobile is going to be one of the key sectors that is going to be affected. Then there is steel, there is cement. All of these constitutes this 120 districts. And if we just look at the workforce, like steel and cement industries employs nearly 2 times the people that are engaged in coal and coal-based power. So we have a bigger challenge with many of these sectors and not just coal. So when we took all of this into account, we tried to define what is just transition. And I'll not read out the definition, it is part of the working paper. But what we wanted to emphasize is that just transition needs to be an comprehensive one. It has to encompass many of the issues, because we see this as an opportunity to ensure a transformative change towards a green economy. There are 5 key components that just transition definition should include in India that we have identified. That it should be about all fossil fuel and downstream fossil fuel dependent sectors, which should be the focus of reaching our net zero. We need socio-economic development through fundamental structural changes. Just transition definition and framing should ensure procedural justice, particularly for it to be an inclusive process. It must ensure universal livelihood with social security measures and poverty eradication, because these regions are poor. Finally, it should look into improvement in environmental and ecological conditions, not just for environmental reasons, but also to secure the health and livelihood and to ensure environmental justice in these regions. And the final thing we have arrived at, which is the main topic of today's discussions, is how do we frame it? Now, looking at all the countries' framing and the discussions that goes on and what needs to be done from our own experience, we feel that it is a development intervention. And it should be done that way. That will also be hugely acceptable in that way. One of the key issues that must be ensured is the social acceptance of the issue, because if that is not there, the plans will not be implementable. Now, if we frame it as a development intervention, there are 5 key components to it. We need certain inputs, certain processes must be ensured, outputs must be well defined, and this all should lead to certain clear outcomes and impacts on the ground. The inputs that will be required in just transition are particularly 3. One is in terms of governance. That is, the state and the center has to work together, and no one can achieve this. It's a huge transition across the country that is going to come. And the state and center, what we know as cooperative federalism, has to be guided by the principles of that. The architecture of governance has to be framed around this. We will need clear policies and plans to take this forward. Right now, India has clear policies on an energy transition, ambition on energy transition. It needs to integrate now a plan for just transition into it. So we need a national policy which is just energy transition policy. We need policies, plan, and investments for restructuring and transitioning our fossil fuel sector and the downstream sector. We need policies, and I would emphasize more on reforms here, to make for responsible environmental and social practices, because in fact India has some of the fantastic laws on all of these, but the problem is they are not up to date or they are not implemented well. So reforms are really necessary in this account. We need plan for economic diversification and revenue substitution, both at the subnational as well as the national level. And finally, we need programs and policies to reskill and skill people for the new economy. Finance will take this forward in the discussions. We need both public and private investments, and of course, international financing. The PM just has put out a huge amount of money that will be required to take forward the energy transition. And then on top of that, we are talking of a just transition to deal with it. So we will need huge amount of financing, and we are yet to quantify what that amount would be. There are three clear processes which will feed into just transition in India. First, we need a diverse coalition, because India's fossil fuel regions are extremely varied in terms of demographics, in terms of people's interests, in terms of their political economy. So a consensus, a political consensus, a public consensus is essential to take this forward. And that will include everyone from the public policy, from the policymakers to civil society, to workers, to unions, to industry, to financial institutions. We need an effective communication strategy that matters to everyone. It can be very actor specific, and actually India Just Transition Center is currently working on this. And finally, we need to build local support systems who can actually see this process through in the next 3 to 4 decades. Then we need certain outputs, which I feel should be very defined with timeframes aligning with our energy transition plan. And this, in fact, all of these outputs we have elaborated in our 5 R's report, which we released this June. There are clear components of the outputs. One is we need a restructured economy. This can be taken up part by part, and industries in this fossil fuel dependent districts and states. We need repurposed land and infrastructure. It holds huge potential in all these regions, because otherwise you will face the issue of land acquisition, land alienation, and all this. It's a huge asset that can be tapped into. Reskilling, upskilling, and newly skilled workforce can be done in phases. In fact, our next report, which we are going to release, shows how step by step that can be done. Revenue substitution challenges, in fact, will be bigger for the state, and that must be looked into through support of center. And finally, we need responsible social and environmental practices to support a green and inclusive development plan. That is what we need it for. Unless we have this, we cannot plan the next course. And finally, this is my last slide, which is the overarching principle, because we need to have clear outcomes, what a vision for this transition. It's a transformative change, we said in the very beginning. Today, we have a net zero emission target, and we should work towards it with clear intermediate outputs. We need net positive employment outcome. This transition should not be a way that some people win and other people lose. It should be a win-win for all. It should have net positive environmental and ecological outcomes. And there are many, many components to it, from pollution reduction to land conservation, biodiversity preservation, ecological protection, because all of these have values for creating lives and livelihoods in this region. So we need to really focus on environmental and ecological outcomes. And in fact, Chandrabhushan can explain it, like there is huge potential of forests in many of our fossil fuel districts still remaining. We need improvement in human development and human capital. For that, we need social structure investments, social sector investments, environmental justice outcomes. And finally, I would say that is last word is we need net positive outcomes in terms of climate resilience, because that will secure the buy-in. We need economic growth. We cannot today think that we will go back. No one is going to accept it. And there are enough opportunities to plan it the right way. And finally, yes, India is a developing country and we all aspire prosperity, and that should be the focus when we plan the new economy. And I'll stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Shrestha, for this very, very comprehensive presentation. One of the things that while we were doing research, we realized was that how much hesitation there was to call it as a development intervention. Everyone is talking about developmental intervention, but not calling it a developmental intervention. They are calling it as a cold transition, and all the component of developmental intervention is there, whether in terms of input, process, output, impact, whether you take Germany or what US is doing, or what labor unions are talking about. These are developmental intervention. And we thought that if we cannot define just transition as a selective either worker issue or a selective coal phase out and thermal power phase out issue, in case of India, and I can think in most developing countries where informal worker and economy is highly concentrated around fossil fuels, it has to be defined as a developmental intervention. That's what, and it has to be defined as a positive developmental intervention. So with this, let me now come back to our panel today. The way I have structured this panel discussion is that I will request all the panelists for their initial remark. They have anywhere between 8 to 10 minutes. If they take less, much better. But 8 to 10 minutes to give their intervention. And then I have a set of questions for the panelists, and we also will have questions, I'm sure, from the audience, which we will take. So let me start the panel discussion by inviting Nikos. Nikos, your take and your inputs. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and Shrestha, thank you for this incredible presentation. Congratulations to you and the team for this piece of work. I think it's a great milestone in advancing the conversation. So congratulations to you. Let me give some perspectives from how things look in the United States, and I think you will see that I will echo a lot of the things that you have in your report, particularly. I think the concept of this being a developmental challenge, no matter how queasy people may get about the language. I mean, I think of this as the context of regional economic development. We've been thinking about the context of regional economic development for a very long time. And it's a lot easier when you put it in those terms that people understand what you're talking about, even if they're uncomfortable. But let me talk a little bit about the backdrop. And some of this stuff is obviously very familiar to a global audience. Number one is the decline of coal in the United States. We've reduced coal use by about 60% over the last 15 years. And the reality is that a lot of the places where coal was either mined or used for power generation, when coal went away, nothing came in to replace it. So that is sort of the context in which policymaking is taking place in the United States. That's one contextual factor. The other contextual factor, of course, is the concept of environmental justice, and your report talks about that a lot. We're talking very much in the United States about where fossil fuel infrastructure is located, who gets the benefits versus who gets the pollution, where the jobs are and who benefits from those jobs, and where the sort of externalities are and who is harmed by those externalities. So that very much shapes the conversation. The third contextual factor, of course, is how do we have everyone participate in the transition, right? So we're talking about between the infrastructure package and the Build Back Better Act in the United States, maybe $2+ trillion worth of spending, of course, not all of it on climate and infrastructure. So the question is, how do we make sure that those benefits accrue to the whole country and not just to the subset of the country? We've had a lot of issues in this country around where solar is developed and who benefits from those jobs, where we put electric charging infrastructure, who benefits from them. So a huge question of justice in terms of the money that we spend. And of course, finally, the contextual factor, which we're not ready to talk about yet, is that over the last 15 years, the United States has emerged as the world's largest producer of both oil and gas. And that if you take the president's targets seriously, the role of natural gas and oil will have to shrink in the next 15, 20 years. And that has profound repercussions for a number of states. About 10 states in the US are heavily dependent on oil and gas revenue in order to run their economies, right? So those are sort of the contextual factors in which we're having this conversation. But of course, there's also the broader backdrop, which is, you talked very much in your report about the role of unions. Well, this is a country where the role of unions has declined, and this is a secular trend over decades, right? And so we're having a different conversation as a result of the decline of unions. You can't have this discussion without talking about race and regional economic inequality, right? So it's impossible to sort of isolate this conversation. So I think very much, as you point out, we have to ground these discussions in the context of the realities of the country. And the other contextual factor that's very important is there's a huge difference in the fossil fuel dependence and economic structure of the different states. You can't talk to Texas in the same way that you talk to New York or Connecticut, and in the same way that you'll talk to Alaska. These are fundamentally different economies that require sort of different approaches and different thinking. And of course, you may have noticed we're a very polarized society, which makes it very difficult to have conversations that sort of feed off sort of the broader political divide, and climate and fossil fuels are very much part of that political divide. So let me talk a little bit about what's on the table right now in Washington and around the country. The flagship initiative, of course, is the president's Justice 40 goal. And the idea is that 40% of the spending that comes out of the federal government on energy and climate should go to disadvantaged communities. So that's a overarching goal that exists at sort of the federal level. But there are other things on the table as well. Environmental remediation, you talked about that. That's a huge priority. It shows up in the context of plugging in and cleaning up abandoned wells. We are a huge hydrocarbon producer. We have a ton of wells left and right that are just been abandoned or produce very little. Cleaning up those areas is a big priority. We have a proposed climate conservation, civilian climate corps to go out in the country and do sort of remediation work, invest in a number of solutions and infrastructure that could be good for climate. So that very much speaks to the trying to mobilize people to be part of the solution and try to employ people in the communities that are affected to be part of the solution. We have a huge push to actually reunionize the United States through the use of credits. So we're trying to essentially offer credits for renewable energy, for electric vehicles, and we're differentiating those credits based on whether the facilities are using union labor or not, right? So it's an interesting method on theory of change that that by offering higher incentives by the federal government, you're going to trigger a change in the labor force in order to sort of reapportion the rents and the income to labor, right? So that's another big experiment. We may not talk about it purely in the context of a just transition, but that's what it is, right? It's about trying to make sure that as we spend this money, who benefits from that money. And finally, there's a big, and I'm just picking some of the major line items, there's more, a big emphasis on channeling investment to places that have either been hurt by the closures of coal or more broadly hydrocarbon rich states. There is, we do a lot of work here at CSIS with states, so we get to talk to states that are sort of service economies as well as industrial states and fossil fuel based states. And there's one common denominator across all states, which is they see the world that's coming and they want to be part of it, right? It's a different conversation if you're in Alaska or in Texas or in Wyoming or West Virginia or in Florida or California. What people put on that is different, but the common denominator is the same. How do I prepare myself and my economy for the world that's coming? So there's a lot of emphasis. The infrastructure framework that was negotiated this summer had a ton of money for CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, storage hubs, for direct air capture, for hydrogen hubs. And an element of where these hubs should be located is the natural resources and endowments of the place, as well as considerations for regional economic balance and regional economic development. So again, the purpose is, how do we put money in places where they can achieve not just an energy transition objective, but some of the broader political, social, and economic objectives of the country. Let me finish with two thoughts of things that I worry about sometimes when I see this conversation. Number one is, I think there is a little bit too much emphasis on replacing old energy jobs with new energy jobs. That if you did coal, you have to do solar. That if you did oil, you have to do wind. And sometimes that makes sense. We are seeing a lot of synergy in the North Sea and in other parts of the world between sort of the oil and gas industry and port development with offshore wind. So there are places, and when you think about CCUS or geothermal, there's a lot of really good synergies between sort of fossil fuel industries and those sectors. But at the same time, just because you used to do energy doesn't mean you have to do energy in the future. So I hope that we don't lose sight of the fact that there are a ton of industries in all sorts of sectors. And I'm not talking about, getting the coal miner to learn how to code. That's a very sort of narrow-minded view of what the solution sets should be. But we should have a broader set of the type of economies and industries that can be created in these places, and that they don't have to all be part of the energy economy, even though the energy economy is going to be big. I think that's one. And the final thing I'll say is, the thing that worries me the most when I look at the United States in carrying out these programs is governance. You talked about governance in your paper. And this is just so crucial. We have, I think, in this country, we have lost some of the muscle memory of how to govern. And so we talk about, how do you bring together the federal government, the states, the local communities, the local institutions, the universities, labor, civil society, how do you bring them together to coalesce around a vision and to do what, as you rightly point out, is a multi-decade type of intervention. This isn't a, let's get together in a room, sign a piece of paper, and boom, we have a just transition. That's just not how it works. And one of the things that I'm always envious of Germany, and we'll hear about that, is the institutional focus, the focus on sort of trying to get consensus and move the thing forward. And sometimes it's slow and frustrating, and that's what sort of consensus implies. But in this country, we're planning to spend a lot of money, but we don't necessarily have the institutions in place to spend that money well. And so that's one of the things that really worries me as I look at all these plans and all this money kind of coming out of Congress is, are we ready to spend it well and to get the most bang over our buck in order to solve these challenges? And so with that, let me finish on this opening intervention. Thank you.
Sorry, Nikos, I think there's some little technical disruption, but we'll give it a second. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Of course. I'm sorry. My video is there's some problem with my video, so I'll be on audio from now onwards. But Nikos, two things actually you said is extremely important. What you said. One was the way US is trying to unionize, in fact, reverse the decline of unions over the last few decades and reverse that process. And the second thing you said was how local communities and states are realizing what the world is going to look like, and they want to be part of the new world. Unfortunately, in India, I don't think that even many think tanks are on board on the issue of new world. They are still thinking about the old world, and the net zero announcement by the Prime Minister actually was a big surprise for many. Not for us. We knew that is going to come, but nevertheless. Let me now request Shailendra for his intervention and what he thinks is happening in South Africa and how South Africa is navigating this issue. Shailendra, your intervention now, please.
Good evening, everybody. Am I audible and visible?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Let me know once you can see my slides. Is it visible on your end?
Yes.
Fantastic. So good evening once again to all attendees and panelists. Thank you to iForest for affording me the opportunity to participate in this webinar, as well as share some of the experience, although a short period of time from a South African perspective, particularly from the perspective of the Presidential Climate Commission. As noted at the start of the session, the just transition means different things to different individuals or people, even in a local context, but it varies quite significantly when looking at different geographies. So, whilst noting the presentation made, Shrestha, I think congrats once again on the paper, and also congrats to India on the target and ambition to 2070 to be net zero. So hopefully there are some similarities from the work that we've been doing that could apply to the Indian context. So I think, first of all, just a very brief introduction about the Presidential Climate Commission. As you may know, the Presidential Climate Commission is a multi-stakeholder body that was established by the President of South Africa in December 2020. Comprised of the Commission are 23 commissioners from different sectors of society, representing business, labor, civil society, academia, and among others. But also importantly, I think government also sits on that commission. It's important to note, though, that this commission sits outside of the government structure, and the intent and the role of the commission is to provide an independent advice to government around the country's response around climate change, but importantly as well to guide on the pathways to achieve a low carbon, climate resilient, and just society in the longer term. And also very importantly is to ensure by the participation and representation of various sectors of society on the commission is to achieve a level of consensus around the just transition, what it means for the various representatives, for people at large, and how do we navigate this complex and challenging path whilst also looking at the opportunities that may sit in front of us and embrace those. So in terms of the commission and what it's meant to do, I think you did allude to in the previous presentation around the vision, and I think I did allude to that, is to develop this common vision around the just transition. And for once, we have a platform where we have participation that is centrally located, that does not sit within the government structure, that utilizes the various inputs from social partners to provide that input, and then also guide the pathways to achieve the vision ultimately. Core and at the center of this is obviously the jobs, particularly around the areas that are most impacted around the coal and mining areas, the technology, the uptake of cleaner technologies, whilst noting the transition that needs to take place, jobs, and trying to seek to ensure that nobody is left behind. Importantly, I think, is the financing aspects around this, and considering South Africa's context similarly to India in terms of its developing nature, while South Africa, an advanced developing economy, still requires the finance to achieve the vision ultimately. And so how do we access climate finance around the different forms, concessional finance, loans, grants, etc. And I think ultimately it's important that we monitor and evaluate the process to ensure that we are continuously improving the effectiveness along the way. Just to paint a picture of the context in South Africa, South Africa, as you may know, has the highest Gini coefficient in the world, the most unequal society in the world, high levels of unemployment, and more than 50% of our population living in poverty. Importantly here, though, is within these national circumstances and challenges that we see in front of us lie the opportunities around job creation, reviving the manufacturing, the manufacturing sector, and looking at different models around ownership other than just privatization. How do we embrace Black and women ownership? But I think importantly is looking at the opportunities around technology, around embedded generation. The President recently announced the lifting of the threshold for embedded generation to 100 megawatts. So this allows now smaller businesses, individuals to start generating these forms of renewable electricity over and above the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, which, if you would have noticed, recently announced the 5th bid window, so opening up that market again for renewables. But I think importantly to note that we still remain very highly located and entrenched within the coal fraternity. Industrial policy as it stands right now is going to be critical in how this evolves into the future. We've recently announced the extension of the Hydrogen Society roadmap for another 10 years, and to look at some of the industries that are located within the coal industry and looking at how moving from forms of gray, blue to ultimately green hydrogen, South Africa could be a net exporter into the global context. But then importantly, looking at then how do we have investors facilitate that transition. So just to talk about some of the work to date and some of the ambition that the Presidential Climate Commission would like to seek to drive. I mean, I did indicate we are pretty new in terms of its establishment, even though we have social partners to date to have already agreed that we should reach net zero CO2 by mid-century. And importantly to note is, so these are the social partners, but importantly within this is a business sector. So if you look at some of the key emitters that account for the bulk of South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions, Sasol, Eskom, the power generator, Anglo-American, and some of the other mining companies have already committed to net zero targets by 2050, some earlier than 2050. And so in terms of pushing for or striving to achieve greater ambition, we recently, while the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment earlier in the year released a draft NDC and its commitment to the UNFCCC, the Commission reviewed the draft, commissioned work, technical work with the input of the social partners around the table to ensure that we have that level of consensus that I did speak to, and put forward a recommendation which we handed over to the President on the 1st of July. That recommendation resulted in the lowering of South Africa's ultimate 2030 commitment, which now brings us into a 2-degree compatible Paris-aligned outlook with almost 1.5 degrees compatible. So a lot of work to do still, but I think whilst noting that our biennial update report also speaks to carbon neutrality by 2050. So I think key looking forward in terms of some of the work, in terms of unpacking the energy sector, is some of the pathways that we are currently establishing to look at how do we achieve carbon neutrality or net zero CO2 by 2050. And here we are looking at unpacking the energy or the electricity generation sector plan, which is termed the Integrated Resource Plan here in South Africa. And what can we do without looking at building new coal? How can we embrace the role of a mix of other energies within the local context? But then importantly, how do we strive beyond just the 2030 timeframe, which is what this plan looks like? So again, so a lot of work to do, but I think what we are doing is we forging this pathway ahead, the roadmap ahead. And important is the alignment aspect to ensure that we establish that buy-in throughout and achieve the momentum that we wish or that we desire. So coming back to sharing some of the elements of a just transition framework, which is a short-term immediate priority for the Commission, we spoke about the vision. And the question is, I also allude to some of the parameters that I4's vision referred to. Some of them very similar. I mean, looking at the country's climate change response, looking at, and within that is a mitigation, adaptation, resilience components, the protection of workers, the protection of livelihoods. How do we embrace a low carbon economic shifts to cleaner production? But importantly, within this is looking at the vulnerable within the South African context. So it's women who drive the local economies and communities, looking at the poor, the unemployed. And I think one of the other parameters is looking at some of the nexus issues within this. So looking at the water, food, energy, land nexus as well. So within this strategy is then looking at the current set of policies, how do we leverage? We also alluded to in an earlier slide, there are great policies in place, but it's the implementation of these and the reforms that are important. So how do we not reinvent the wheel, but utilize what's already in place to ensure that we reach these objectives? And I think looking at these policies and having prioritized them, how do we look at implementing key initial first moves that in the next 5 years that allow us to reach a 2050 ambition? Important is obviously the governance aspects from the national to municipal level, but ensuring that the buy-in from our people are part and parcel and heard during the process. Ultimately, again, monitoring and evaluation as alluded to previously. So just on a high level, the process around us developing the Just Transition Framework. We commenced this around the middle of the year, and we commissioned work around the desktop review. It would be great if you could distribute these slides later on. The hyperlinks are also available within this, and you're more than welcome to refer to our website for these reports, which you could access and further bolster some of the research work that you've done, particularly around the South African context. And it's important to note as well, something that I should have mentioned at the outset, these engagements are open to the entire public of South Africa. We hold them via YouTube links, via Facebook live streaming, and so we do not discriminate in terms of who can and can't participate. So it's from the highest tiers in government to the layman on the street that can participate. So we've developed a desktop review in August that speaks to the local context around the just transition as well as the international context. It takes some lessons on that. But importantly, what this does within this document is lands the vision or an amalgamated vision for South Africa in terms of the just transition looking forward. Some of the parameters that I alluded to earlier are key within that vision. And this built on some of the key work that the National Planning Commission had conducted during the period of 2017 to 2019. Like we said, the intent of the commission is to look at an evidence-based approach and not necessarily reinvent good work that has already been done. We commenced the process with engaging with stakeholders, the various social partners that I referred to at the outset, on bilateral basis, on a multilateral basis, and then we moved into policy dialogues. And as inputs into the policy dialogues, we commissioned the development of 6 policy briefs on key topics being the policy dynamics around the just transition, the coal value chain, employment linked to livelihoods, the water aspects linked to the nexus issues, financing a just transition, and finally governance around the just transition. The stakeholder dialogues, so post each of the development of each of these policy dialogues, we then moved into stakeholder dialogues. So these are multi-stakeholder platforms where we've had this during the period of September, with the last one ending this Friday on governance. What we intend to do with this is take the salient themes, the areas of divergence, but importantly, the areas of consensus, and build them into a draft framework. And what we intend to do with the draft framework is that we have this framework that, whilst noting the key pieces of work being done by various sectors within the economy, there is a blueprint to now work from. So what will that framework will do is set the boundaries around the concept of the just transition, and then start to unpack. And that can be applied to the different sectors around energy and the others, to start unpacking these, to look at the detail around that. We intend to then commence with community dialogues on a grassroots level early in the new year, where we go to the coal fields, where we engage with the communities on the ground to listen to their thoughts, to ensure that this is a fully inclusive process, and then move into a multi-stakeholder conference where we hope to land the framework. The framework is not intended to be a final document that's developed and shelved. It's intended to be something that's living, depending on changes in the local context, as well as those from a macro context that impacts South Africa. So I think moving on to then, I think that's in a nutshell where we are. But I think importantly, we have a few events at COP26. The first one being looking at the journey around the just transition, where we have commissioners, or 4 commissioners representing business, organized labor, civil society, and the youth, providing their views on what they see the just transition to be, from their perspective, how they envisage the changes that need to be made from their perspective, linked up to the economy, but then also providing a view from the International Trade Union Confederation Just Transition Center, which provides some of the opening remarks post that provided by the Deputy Chair of the Commission. So that's taking place on the 8th of November. I've included links as well where you can participate in person or virtually. And then moving on to the 9th of November, where we have financing the just transition, looking at how we look at the opportunities around financing, but importantly, what does a just transition transaction mean for South Africa in ensuring that we achieve that vision? So perhaps I'd like to leave it as at there and then hopefully take some questions a little later. Thank you.
Thank you, Shailendra. We are really exciting presentation in terms of the process, at least, that you're following. I mean to say, it's a very well-planned process, and the way you're trying to engage with everyone involved. It's about 1.5-year process. Am I right? You will take about 18 months.
Correct. Yes. So this, I would say, from the time that we actually for the framework itself, probably a year just to develop that, but then also moving into some of the refinements thereafter, and application of the framework moves into a much longer term, short to medium term type of approach.
But very exciting, and I'm sure that I'm already seeing a lot of questions on process about South Africa been asked by the audience. So we'll get back to you. Now, may I request now our third panelist, Lucas, your intervention, please. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks also for inviting me and having me here on this panel, and congratulations to this report, which I think will be a great seed sown to really grow this just transition debate in India. So I'd like to talk about 3 aspects of just transition that perhaps I wish were treated more explicitly in Germany. I'll explain a little bit how this turned out to become part of the just transition, but I don't think that there was an explicit process, which I think is a pity, and it is an opportunity to you to consider when you start this debate and start developing a framework for just transition. So the 3 aspects are the scope of just transitions, the goals of just transition, and then finally the cost of just transition. First, let's talk about the scope of the transition. So just transition, what does it mean? It is about justice in justice. This can mean a lot of different types of injustice. It can be about kind of the existing injustice of the current energy system, which are already there. And you touch upon this briefly when you talk about the health implications and the poor, particularly poor situation of many people in the Indian regions. You can talk about the injustices of the new system, which hasn't been discussed at all in this panel and in many other exercises. Obviously, there might be injustices when you build new dams or large solar panel arrays. Where are the resources coming from? A whole set of potential injustices on the new system. And then obviously there are the injustices of phasing out the existing power coal system. You can talk about the implications of just transition at the regional level, at the national level, or international implications. You can talk about current, already experienced injustices, or kind of imminent injustices, or only anticipated in 10 years, 15 years time injustices. So Germany did for some reason, the German just transition debate, as you rightly point out, is very narrowly defined, focusing on the regional aspects, focusing on this transitory aspects of what are the injustices assigned with the phasing out of the current coal system. And it is focusing quite exclusively on the supply side. That is why oil and gas are not really in the focus either, because we don't have any oil and gas supply industries in Germany. There is some emerging discourse now on just transition in the automotive industry, but it's not salient yet, I would say. But I think, and you do this in your paper to some extent, I think it's a good opportunity to try to reframe just transition and think about more explicitly, what kind of injustices are you targeting and addressing and including in your framework? I think the German definition, if that's even a definition, if the kind of the discourse, the consensus discourse about just transition is too narrow by not taking into account a broader set of injustices. So the second part is the goal of the transition. So what is the benchmark for success when you look at it at the regional level? What is the aspired status ex post of that region, right? So sometimes you get the impression when you look at the German coal regions, especially in Eastern Germany, there is this fantasy that they will somehow magically get back to this illusionary, nostalgic idea of the prosperous coal industry in the 1975 time, right? So probably this fantasy that some people have in mind never was there. It's just kind of the nostalgia of the past that they aspire to regain, which is wrong, I think. A more realistic expectation would be to look at what the prospect of the industry was before this whole just transition process was started. And it was already kind of in the decline, so there is not so much difference. But is that the benchmark for success? So to just compensate, to come out onto the not so good outlook that the industry had before the coal transition was officially kind of initiated. You can also do the competitive look at this, right? So the Lusatia region in Eastern Germany, compared to its neighboring regions, it's relatively well off. But compared to German average, it is still a relatively low developed region. So what is the appropriate benchmark for this region for a successful transition? Should it be at the level of its neighboring regions? Should it maintain its current level, or should it get to kind of German averages? And again, thinking this through for India, this is a completely different challenge, right? In Germany, we're talking about regions that are kind of grown up and even declining in some areas, whereas you rightly pointed this out as a development challenge. Yeah. So what is the level of a development that the coal region should achieve in the next 15, 20 years compared to other regions that also have still big development requirements? So I think it's crucial to talk about this, what the vision is and what you want to achieve with a successful just transition, because that's what brings me to the cost of the transition. So the cost for what? The cost for achieving, you need this kind of benchmark, or at least some implicit agreement on what a good, successful just transition could look like to calculate the costs. And there are different cost types that should be considered. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about stranded assets of the capital, invested capital that's there. I think there is very little research, and that's rather problematic, about the human capital that's also at the risk of stranding, at least in many developed regions. We have a lot of high-skilled workers in the regions, and the question is, can they use their skills and experiences in other sectors as well, or is it just a stranded asset after they get laid off? But it's really hard to find even figures or statistical information on the kind of jobs employed in the industry and the job markets that are there for those professions, for those skills in other adjacent industries and regions. So I think that is something to consider. Obviously, there is legacy costs on rehabilitation, maintaining or decommissioning existing infrastructures. That is something that you can count up to. We keep on saying, so when you approach this just transition, this regional stretches just transition perspective, you can kind of choose or distribute between bailing out the workers, bailing out the companies, and bailing out the regions. My first priority would be to look at the regions. If you bail out the workers, there will be a lot of hardship among the people that are not directly employed there in the regions. If you bail out the companies, there's a high risk that the money is going into the wrong pockets and will be invested elsewhere, not in the regions. You need to focus on the regions to do what Nikos, you said, to properly start a regional development discussion. That doesn't say that there shouldn't be any compensation, but the question is, where's the focus? So, and finally, my final thought when you discuss the cost of just transition is to be very careful not to conflate costs and prices. So when you look at the German coal phase out, we did have a coal commission that was instituted by the German government with experts to discuss the phase out schedule and as well as compensatory structural change support measures. And they came up with a recommendation to spend 2 billion euros per year for the next 20 years, so 40 billion euros in structural funds. And this has become kind of the sticker prize of just transition in Germany, but this is a political prize. So actually, I interviewed people in the commission, and they, in the last night, hours before they constructed the consensus, someone changed the number from 1 billion per year to 2 billion per year. And it wasn't even debated in the plenary of this co-commission. It was just a backroom decision, political decision. And it is kind of not a surprise to me because, for example, the financial ministry was not on the table. So the solution space was unconstrained on the financial end, making it relatively easy to come up with such an enormous number. And finally, we don't even know what this price was paid for. It's partly political, and it is the result of a very peculiar market, as I call it. Even if it's kind of a it's not a classical market in a sense, but it's people negotiating, and that outcomes a price. And I always am wary about talking about this 40 billion sticker price when we need to make sure that it's a price that's a result of a specific negotiation that took place under specific political economy cases. And if you want to do things like that in your country, I think you are very well advised to think carefully about the structures of the market that is producing the price of transition. And the cost of transition is a different issue that requires empirical research, which is not necessarily aligned with the price. So I think this is my reflections on your paper, the German case, bringing it together. And I think your paper is a good starting point, and perhaps some of those ideas will continue to develop this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucas. I think you raised some very interesting point in terms of what we can learn from Germany. When I looked at the money being paid to companies, I was very surprised. Some of the coal power plants are actually 45 years old, who are going to be paid €1 million per megawatt. You can construct in India a supercritical coal-based power plant with that price. So the kind of compensation to depreciated assets that is being paid to Germany was something which was quite surprising to me. But I think you brought that point very clearly, that how do you decide what is the cost, and must differentiate between cost and price. Also expectation. We don't have, what is it that we are targeting over 20 to 30 years? That expectation and vision, both are related, but nevertheless, I think managing expectation is also going to be very important in this entire process. Now, thank you very much. I think very exciting intervention from all three of you. We have a number of questions, and I intend that all the questions are answered quickly by all three of you. So let me start by, there are a few questions, Shrestha, to you with Indian scenario. I will come back to you in the end. Let me start.
And I think CB will have many opportunities to do that, and we can send back in writing.
So I would like our colleagues from South Africa, Germany, and US to actually answer some of these questions. So the first question is to Shailendra. Actually, basically the question, and Prakriti is asking this question, that we are looking at systemic changes here, okay, and how. It is easy to take a small silo-based approach as a demonstration that such a transition is possible without compromising on the need of key stakeholders. So her question is, can we do a pilot on a small to see how it will happen before we decide what to do in totality? That's a question for you, Shailendra. The other question is again for Shailendra is, I think Shailendra can answer that, is how do you fit spatial justice and around energy and climate justice? So this is the second question that you can answer. So let me start with Shailendra with these two questions to you first.
Thanks for those questions. So I think let me start off, on the first one around a siloed approach. I think we need to be quite careful when we speak about a silo approach. I think a silo approach, meaning one sort of constituency undertaking a type of project, on its own, that's not integrated with those within the economy. It's really important that any type of pilot project on the ground is bought into from government all the way down to all stakeholders within the economy. And these projects, and these are some of the projects that we have kicked off already in Mpumalanga, as has alluded to see how best we can utilize these transition projects. I mean, we have coal-fired power stations that are closing in the next few months. There are already work around the repurposing and repowering of these outside of the coal focus. But remember, again, this is brought into by the various government departments, from the president all the way down to business, to civil society, labor, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important that we have a complete buy-in on that. If I may touch on just a few other questions that I did pick up on the chat and Q&A.
Yes, please.
At it. Yes. So the second one was the role of communities. It is absolutely critical that communities bring their voice to the table. And this is the platform that we have created through our engagements to date virtually. However, as I alluded to in the new year, via face-to-face on-the-ground type of engagement. We've seen this happen historically, where in the gold industry in South Africa, the towns and the economies and the microeconomies that were created are non-existent today. That is a case in point in terms of what we don't want to let happen as part of the transition away from coal and other minerals, but also thinking about the future around what the future of minerals is in terms of green technologies and green economies. And I think just the other one that I did pick up as well is around the developmental goals. It is absolutely critical that we need to consider this. Knowing South Africa's economy is muted at best at this point in time, we need to look at how we revive the existing economies whilst thinking about the longer term, whilst thinking about the jobs, the skills for the future, and the transition to those ultimately of hydrogen and so on and so forth. So I think that's important. The issues around justice are absolutely at the heart of this. I mean, if you are looking at a just transition from the perspective of just the energy or just the energy transition, then I think we are going to be short-sighted in our approach. I think we need to look at this holistically, looking at all aspects of justice, looking at the health impacts, looking at some of the service delivery issues that we have at the moment, and how we address these while transitioning within the overall context of a just transition. So I think, and those spatial contexts as well is pretty important within this, and how we're looking at designing those for the future.
Shailendra, there is another question related to that, related to South Africa, which is that you are giving incentive for export of green hydrogen. Is human development a big part of JT framework in South Africa? So
we're not as yet. I mean, the hydrogen economy is something that's still yet to be defined within South Africa. I mean, we've just looked at some of the big potentials for the hydrogen economy, like the Sasols of the world in terms of the liquid fuels and chemicals industry. I've only recently signed MOUs with some of the partners to look at how this economy can be embraced. But the human capital aspects of this are absolutely critical. I mean, remember, in looking at transitioning these existing facilities to those that produce green hydrogen at the end of the day, you're not going to have to replace existing skills with new skills. The important aspect of this is not only from a public sector perspective, it's how private sector is starting to think about the skills of today versus the skills of tomorrow. I think the compensation aspects, etc., are outside of that there, but I think the human capital is ultra critical in terms of achieving those ambitions.
Thank you. Nikos, I would like to put the question on reclamation of mines. What has been the experience of US on reclamation and repurposing? Has there been successful examples of that?
Sorry, I don't mean to chuckle, but I feel like this has not been a very successful story in the US. I think we've seen both on the mine side as well as on the power plant side, just like a lot of closures. I think one of the, I listened to your comments in response to what Lucas was saying about the compensation to the companies and all that. And I always kind of like also caution on the other extreme, which was the American experience, which is let's, for lack of a better word, just blow things up and like, who cares? Like, let's see what happens. Like the market kind of like destroyed these sectors. And at the end of the day, there was no one there to like pick up the pieces. And I think there's a lot of examples of either through bankruptcies or like transferring the assets to like weaker companies over time. At the end of the day, and with no real provision and regulation for what to do at the end of these assets, that has been a lot more of the experience, I think, across the board in the United States, which is why we're starting from a huge amount of effort to go and pick up those pieces. I think the experience of the United States has not been very positive on that. I think our sort of legal and regulatory system has allowed a lot of degradation to happen over time, and it's going to be very difficult and expensive to claw back from where we are today, unfortunately.
The other one is maybe you and then Lucas can answer it, because I think Shailendra has already answered that. Essentially looking at bottom-up planning. With you, Nikos first, and then I'll come back to Lucas on experience of Germany on bottom-up planning. Nikos.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critical. I mean, at the end of the day, when I think about where the federal government is, you're going to write some really massive checks, and in order for those checks to be cashed, like people have to have ideas about what to do with the money, right? And this is a huge challenge, and I think it's primarily a challenge because you don't always have like institutions and plans that are just sitting around waiting to be put in to be executed. So I think that's a massive challenge, and particularly is a massive challenge in places. We talked, and I didn't want to give too rosy of a picture about people that are already looking into the future. There are a lot of people that are clinging on to the past, right? And if you go to a community that is clinging on to the past, it's very difficult to get them to do a serious plan of money is coming, where do you want to spend it? If they're still stuck on, no, like don't talk to me about that world. I want to go back to the world that used to exist. So I think it is a major challenge. So I absolutely embrace the need for local planning. They know their needs, they know what works, they know the institutions they can bring to bear. But I think there's a lot of work to be done to build up that capacity and to build up that pipeline of projects. We talk about finance. Finance has to go to something, right? If finance is not just a thing, you're not just like make finance available. Finance goes to a specific project. So developing those projects and those ideas, that's crucial. And that I think is where the real work is going to happen once we have a clear signal from Congress about what it wants to spend money on.
Lucas, on bottom-up planning, did Germany did a good job, or was it a negotiation at the top?
Well, I don't think it's a conclusive answer yet. So I think there is a big risk that when it comes to bottom-up planning, there is a tendency that people reach into the drawers and see what they still have there from 20 years ago. And usually those plans are not the ones that are really aligned with the kind of sustainable long-term vision that we have for those regions. So there have been floated quite some ideas that I would personally find difficult to see with structural change. Support for structural change, right? Building Autobahn extensions that have been planned 20 years ago and for good reasons have never materialized to do this. I mean, but there are examples that are, I think, much better equipped, and at least here in the Rhineland area of Germany. So that, for the implementation of the money, the federal state levels have a crucial role to play. And there are differences in how the states do this. I'm more familiar with my home state of North Rhine-Westphalia in the west of Germany, in the Rhineland area, where there is quite an elaborate process on programming and spending that money. This is a process that is pretty integrative, at least on paper. Obviously, there are some people who are saying that there is not enough participation. The tricky situation here in the Rhineland area is that from many perspectives, it's not really a region in an economic sense or in a cultural sense. It is at the fringe of 3 strong economic regions, and there is a lot of competition between those regions. And one key challenge was to kind of coordinate all the administrations and jurisdictions that are in one way or the other responsible for parts of the coal region, and find a mechanism to coordinate the spending of the structural change money. I think they came up with a reasonably working system so far, but I have also heard voices from mayors from the region saying it's too complicated. It takes so long to get the approval for the spending that they never will be able to spend all the money that they have allocated. Whether that will be true in the future, I don't know. But yeah, I think it seems we're doing kind of okay. I think what's lacking is strong guidance on sustainability criteria for spending the money. There are processes ongoing to make up for that deficit. There's always room for improvement, but yeah, it's learning by doing, I guess.
Okay, thanks. I will take 2 more minutes. We have reached 7:30 India time, but I would like Shrestha to answer a few questions. Shrestha, one is gender, and there is a question related to gender, what role gender will have in just transition policy and planning. And the second question is related to subnational policies right now, which are not inclusive. We have a very poor experience in this country where subnational planning has excluded people, and you have alluded to that fact in your paper. So if you can touch these 2 issues, and then rest of the question we will answer through email. So please, these 2 questions.
Yeah. So briefly to touch on the issue of gender, the entire extractive industry is extremely it's heavily male focused. There is really, really low participation of the women in workforce, in fact, negligible. But the bigger question of gender is, and this is something we are capturing through our ground research, is that there is a huge sense of violence, disparity that can come up. It's not planned well, because men are going to lose their jobs and it is going to bear on the women. Women are already doing the backbreaking work. They're part of mostly the informal workforce. So in our own work, we are heavily focusing on how just transition can be gender inclusive. Therefore, some of the key components in our reports, in our earlier study, we have focused on women education, how to build livelihoods around them, what are certain financing mechanisms. And there are many, many projects, many schemes of the government that are targeted towards women. Now, these have to be leveraged. But yes, gender disparity can increase hugely if it's not integrated in these plans and programs. The second question is that the local level policy and planning. The good news about India is that we have mechanisms elaborated over the years for local level planning. All our local level interventions have talked about leveraging the scope of bottom-up planning involving. The problem right now is what I think we all focused on today is the capacity to plan. So are people can engage? There are so many plans, so many schemes at the local level that people don't know what to do where. So capacity building and consolidation will be a huge, huge way just to put forth these ideas and push it through. But I believe that there is no alternative to that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, and we can discuss this more. Mechanisms are in place. They need to be brought together and strengthened. That is what we need to focus on.
Thank you very much. To all my panelists, we had a really, stimulating discussion. And we will continue to have this discussion. This is just the beginning of discussion on just transition in India. We will have another discussion on 9th, as I said at the beginning of the program, where we will discuss both, where will the money come from, and how do we do an international cooperation on just transition, what that cooperation should look like. My colleague Mandvi is working on a very exciting paper on that. We will bring new ideas. So please do join us on 9th. I would like to thank again all my panelists, my colleague Shrestha, all our colleagues at iForest for organizing this. Have a good evening, wherever you are, or good afternoon, or good morning. See you on 9th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much.